You're not fit to make decisions about this property anymore, Dad. We already talked to a lawyer. Tiffany said it standing in my own kitchen, arms crossed, while my son stared at the floor, like the linoleum had suddenly become the most interesting thing in Wisconsin. And my daughter Jessica stood by the door, with her hand pressed flat against her mouth like she was trying to hold the words in before they could do any more damage. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just looked at the three of them standing in the house I built with my own two hands, and I said very quietly, "Is that right? My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 67 years old. I spent 41 years as a licensed land surveyor in northern Wisconsin, which means I have spent my entire adult life reading boundaries. Other people couldn't see property lines buried under 60 years of undergrowth, easements nobody remembered signing, deeds with mistakes that had been quietly costing families money for 2 generations. I know how to look at a piece of paper and find the one sentence that changes everything. I did not expect that skill to end up saving my own house from my own children. But that's exactly what happened. And if you want to know how a 67-year-old man with a bad knee and a fishing boat ended up sitting across from a county sheriff's deputy, explaining exactly how his daughter-in-law tried to steal a lake house out from under him, stick around, because I'm going to tell you the whole thing, starting from before any of them knew I was paying attention. Before I get into it, tell me in the comments what state you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had someone in your own family underestimate you, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. I need to go back about 4 years, because that's when I lost my wife Diane, and that's when everything that happened later actually started, even though none of us knew it yet. Diane and I built the lake house together in 1987, board by board, on 11 acres on the north shore of a lake up near Hayward that most tourists never find because it isn't on any of the resort maps. I surveyed the property myself before we ever broke ground, drove the corner pins in with my own hands, and Diane planted a ring of wild lupine around the base of the big white pine by the dock that came back every single June for 37 years. She died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in March, fast and without warning, the kind of death that doesn't give you any time to say the things you meant to say. 2 days before she went into the hospital, though, she said something to me I never forgot. She said, "Walter, keep an eye on Ryan. He's got a good heart, but he doesn't have a spine, and someday somebody's going to figure that out and use it." I laughed it off at the time. I wish I hadn't. Ryan is our son. He's 34, and he married a woman named Tiffany about 6 years ago, a licensed real estate agent who specializes, as she likes to put it, in premium lakefront development opportunities, which is a fancy way of saying she helps developers buy up old family cabins from elderly owners and turn them into 6-unit luxury duplexes with hot tubs shaped like the state of Wisconsin. I didn't dislike Tiffany right away. I want to be honest about that. She was polished, she was attentive, she remembered my birthday and Diane's favorite casserole, and always brought a bottle of good bourbon when they visited. But I've spent 4 decades reading fine print for a living, and somewhere around year 2 of their marriage, I started noticing the way Tiffany's eyes moved around my house whenever she visited, not looking at the pictures on the wall, not looking at Diane's old quilts, but looking at square footage, at shoreline, at the dock, doing math in her head that had nothing to do with family. My daughter Jessica is 31, works as a school counselor 2 hours south in Eau Claire, and has always been close to me in a way that Ryan, bless him, never quite managed. She calls every Sunday. She's the one who noticed things before I did, actually, though neither of us said much about it out loud for a long time. Because, what do you say? I think my daughter-in-law is planning something? It sounds paranoid until it doesn't. The first small crack showed up about 2 years ago, in late spring. Tiffany started leaving things around during her visits, not obviously, not clumsily, but a brochure for an assisted living community in Rhinelander tucked under a magazine on the coffee table, a pamphlet about aging in place versus downsizing left in the guest bathroom like it had wandered in there by accident. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I filed it away. The same way I file away a boundary discrepancy on a survey, not enough yet to build a case, but enough to know I needed to keep watching. Then, about 14 months ago, Tiffany brought up the lake house directly for the first time, over dinner, very casually, the way a person brings up something they've already decided and are just testing the room. She said the property taxes on 11 acres of lakefront must be getting hard to manage on a fixed income. I told her I managed fine. She said the Whitmore Group, a development company she'd been working with on several other lakefront parcels in the area, had been looking at properties exactly like mine, and that the number they'd be willing to pay would set up whoever inherited it very comfortably. I remember the phrase exactly. Whoever inherited it. Not you, Dad. Whoever inherited it. I looked at Ryan when she said it. He didn't meet my eyes. That night, after they left, I sat in my workshop out behind the garage. The same workshop where I've kept every survey plat, every deed, every piece of paperwork from 41 years of work. And I thought about Diane's warning. Someday, somebody's going to figure that out and use it. I thought about the 11 acres, the dock, the lupine, the boundary pins I'd driven into the ground myself as a young man with my whole life still ahead of me. And I decided, the way I decide most things, methodically and without telling anyone right away, that I was going to protect this place the same way I'd protect any client's property from a bad faith claim, with paperwork so clean nobody could argue with it. I called an old friend of mine, Gerald Fenn, who'd practiced elder law and estate planning out of a small office in Hayward for almost as long as I'd been surveying. Gerald and I went fishing together twice a year, and he'd handled Diane's and my will years earlier, so he knew the family. I told him I wanted to talk about protecting the lake house specifically, not the whole estate, just that piece of land, from anyone who might try to force a sale or claim decision-making authority over it down the road. Gerald asked me directly, "Walter, is this about anyone in particular?" I said, "Let's just say I want the umbrella up before it starts raining." He didn't push further. 3 weeks later, I signed the paperwork to place the lake house into an irrevocable land trust, with myself as sole trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime, and a clause. Gerald was very specific about this, stating that any transfer, sale, encumbrance, or change in decision-making authority over the property required my personal written consent, notarized with a mandatory 10-day waiting period, and that any attempt to establish guardianship or power of attorney over the property specifically would trigger an automatic legal review by the trust's named co-trustee, which was Gerald's firm itself. I put the original documents in the fireproof filing cabinet in my workshop, the same cabinet that had held every survey I'd ever completed, and I told exactly 2 people, Gerald and Jessica. I didn't tell Ryan. I didn't tell Tiffany. I went back to fishing and mowing the lawn and pretending I hadn't just quietly built a wall around the one thing I couldn't stand to lose. For the next several months, things were quiet on the surface. Tiffany didn't mention the lake house again, at least not to me directly. But Jessica started calling more often with small things she'd noticed. Tiffany asking Ryan pointed questions about my memory, whether I'd repeated myself lately, whether I seemed as sharp as he used to be. Small comments dropped at family gatherings, always sounding concerned, always sounding loving. "Have you noticed your dad seems a little more forgetful? I just worry about him out there alone on that lake." I want to be fair to Tiffany here. because a story like this deserves fairness even toward the person causing the damage. I learned much later, from Ryan, that Tiffany's own family had lost a lake cabin 2 counties over when she was a teenager. Her father defaulted on a balloon mortgage payment, and the bank took the property in a foreclosure auction inside of 90 days, and Tiffany watched the only stable home she'd ever known get sold to strangers for a fraction of what it was worth. That history doesn't excuse what she did to me, but it explains something about why an 11-acre lakefront parcel with a paid-off mortgage looked, to her, less like my home and more like an injustice waiting to be corrected in her favor. The escalation, once it actually started, moved faster than I expected. On a Thursday in early September, about 3 weeks before everything came to a head, Ryan called and asked if I'd be willing to see a doctor a friend of Tiffany's recommended, just for a general wellness check, nothing serious. I said sure, I hadn't had a physical in a while anyway. What I didn't know, what I only learned much later from the actual case file, was that this appointment with a Dr. Patricia Voss, a family friend of Tiffany's from her college days who ran a small independent practice outside Rhinelander, was never billed or logged as a general physical. It was billed internally as a cognitive capacity evaluation. The entire appointment lasted 12 minutes. Dr. Voss asked me to name the current president, count backward from 100 by sevens, and draw a clock face. I did all three without any trouble, mildly annoyed at the pointlessness of it, and went home and forgot about it entirely. 3 weeks later, Dr. Voss signed a formal capacity evaluation, stating that I exhibited moderate cognitive impairment consistent with early-stage dementia, with diminished capacity to manage complex financial and property decisions. A document that, as far as I have ever been able to determine, bore no relationship whatsoever to the 12 minutes we'd actually spent together. The day everything happened was a Saturday, the last weekend of September. The weekend I go up to the family cabin my brother owns 2 hours north for our annual fishing trip, a tradition going back almost 20 years, and one that Tiffany, I would later realize, knew about well in advance because I'd mentioned it at Sunday dinner a month earlier. I left Friday afternoon. I got back Sunday evening, tired, sunburned, with a cooler full of walleye, and drove down my own gravel driveway to find that my key no longer worked in my own front door. I stood there on my own porch for a full minute before I understood what I was looking at. The lock had been changed. A brand new deadbolt, brass still shiny, no wear on it at all. There was a folded piece of paper taped to the inside of the glass storm door where I could read it from outside. A notice, formatted like a legal filing, informing me that a petition for emergency guardianship and conservatorship had been filed in Sawyer County District Court on my behalf, citing concerns for personal safety and financial exploitation risk, supported by a physician's evaluation, and that, pending a hearing, my son Ryan Higgins had been granted temporary authority over decisions regarding the property at this address. There was a phone number for a locksmith taped beneath it, in case I needed temporary access. My own son had locked me out of the house I built with my own hands, using paperwork I'd never seen, based on an appointment I'd been told was a routine physical. I sat down on the porch steps in the dark, with a cooler of fish going warm in the truck bed, and for about 10 minutes I did not move at all. Then I called Jessica. She was already crying when she picked up. She said she'd found out only 2 days earlier. Tiffany had told her it was just a precaution, that they were worried about me being alone on the property, that the whole thing was temporary and being done for my own good. Jessica said she'd tried to talk Ryan out of it and he'd shut down, told her Tiffany knew people who understood this stuff better than either of them did that it was already moving forward and there was nothing to be done. I told Jessica to meet me at Gerald Fenn's office, first thing Monday morning. I did not raise my voice. I did not drive back to that door and pound on it. I drove into town, checked into the small motel off Highway 27. I'd stayed in 100 times over the years for surveying jobs. And I called Gerald that night from the parking lot. Gerald, to his credit, did not sound surprised, which told me he'd half expected something like this from the moment I'd first come to him about the trust. He told me to bring every piece of correspondence I had, and to say absolutely nothing to Ryan or Tiffany until we'd met. Before you go any further with me on this, if you were in my position that Sunday night, locked out of your own home by your own son, would you have driven straight up there and confronted them, or would you have done what I did and waited? Tell me in the comments, because I go back and forth on it myself even now. Monday morning. In Gerald's office, we went through the petition line by line. Gerald had already pulled the court filing that morning, and what we found was worse than either of us expected. The guardianship petition, filed by an attorney none of us recognized, named Ryan as proposed guardian, cited Dr. Voss's evaluation as primary evidence, and this was the part that made Gerald go very quiet and very still, included a proposed asset management plan that specifically recommended liquidating the lakefront property at 4471 Birchwood Point Road to fund appropriate long-term care arrangements, with an attached preliminary purchase offer already drawn up from a buyer entity called Whitmore Lakefront Holdings, LLC. The offer was for $610,000. Gerald pulled a comparable sales report on the spot. Properties like mine, with that much shoreline and that kind of dock access, had been selling in the area for upward of $950,000. They weren't just trying to take my house. They were trying to take it for roughly 2/3 of what it was worth to a buyer Tiffany had a professional relationship with, using a guardianship built on a 12-minute conversation about a clock. Here is where the trust Gerald and I had built 2 years earlier mattered more than I could have imagined when I signed it. Because the property was held in an irrevocable land trust with Gerald's firm as automatic co-trustee for exactly this scenario, any guardianship petition affecting the property triggered an immediate mandatory legal review, which meant that even if a court granted temporary guardianship over my general affairs, the lake house itself was legally untouchable, without a separate court process specifically challenging the trust, a process that would take months and require proving the trust itself was invalid. Ryan's attorney, whoever had drafted this in a hurry, either hadn't known about the trust or had assumed, wrongly, that a guardianship order would simply override it. It wouldn't. It couldn't. The house was never actually in danger of being sold, but I still had a forged capacity evaluation on file, a court petition with my son's name on it, and a family that had tried to have me declared incompetent behind my back, and none of that was going to fix itself with paperwork alone. Gerald and I decided, sitting in his office that Monday, that we were going to do exactly what I would do with any surveying client trying to steal a boundary. Gather the evidence quietly, completely, and irrefutably, before we ever confronted anyone directly. I did not go back to the lake house. I stayed at the motel. I let Ryan believe, for the next 2.5 weeks, that I either didn't know or was too overwhelmed to fight back. Jessica, meanwhile, became something I hadn't expected her to become, an investigator in her own right. She started by talking to Dr. Voss's office directly, posing as a concerned family member confirming appointment details, and discovered that the practice's own records showed the visit had been scheduled and billed under a generic wellness check code, never as a cognitive evaluation, meaning the 12-minute conversation had been retroactively repackaged into a clinical diagnosis that didn't match the actual billing or intake paperwork. A discrepancy, Gerald said, when we showed him, was the kind of thing that ends a medical license. Jessica also, with real courage I don't think either of us knew she had, went through some old family group text threads still on her phone and found a message Tiffany had sent Ryan back in July that Ryan had apparently forgotten was still sitting there, unarchived. Once the guardianship is approved, we don't even need a full sale. We can lease the shoreline to Whitmore directly and split the management fee, way cleaner than waiting for probate. Jessica sent that screenshot to me and Gerald without telling Ryan, and I remember reading it standing in the motel parking lot at 11 o'clock at night and feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the exact moment grief turns into resolve. We had one more piece to find, and it came from a source I hadn't expected. Marcus Webb, the locksmith whose number had been taped to my own front door. Jessica tracked him down, and rather than dodge the question, he was surprisingly candid. He told her he'd been hired by a woman matching Tiffany's description, that she'd shown him a document she claimed was a court order authorizing the lock change, and that something about the whole job had bothered him enough that he'd kept a copy of the paperwork she'd handed him, in case anybody ever asked. That paperwork turned out to be a photocopy of the guardianship petition itself, not yet granted by any judge, just filed, with a handwritten note in the margin that read, "Approved, proceed." In handwriting Gerald was later able to match, through the court's own records, to Tiffany's signature on an earlier real estate closing document. She had told the locksmith the guardianship was already approved when it hadn't even had its first hearing. By the second week of October, Gerald had built a file that included the mismatched medical billing records, the July text message, the locksmith's copy of the falsified approved petition, and a formal comparative market analysis proving the Whitmore offer was significantly under fair value. He filed an emergency motion to dismiss the guardianship petition and, separately, a request for a court hearing on the matter with all of us, myself, Gerald, and a county elder abuse investigator named Detective Renata Cole, who Gerald brought in once he saw the falsified documents, scheduled to appear. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in late October in a small courtroom in the Sawyer County Courthouse that I had actually surveyed the parking lot addition for 20 years earlier, a detail I found almost funny under the circumstances. I walked in wearing the same blue blazer I'd worn to Diane's funeral, because it was the only blazer I owned, and I sat down at the respondent's table next to Gerald. Ryan was there with his own attorney, looking like a man who had not slept properly in 3 weeks. Tiffany sat beside him, composed, dressed like she was closing a real estate deal, which in a sense, I suppose, she believed she still was. The judge, a woman named Judge Alvarez, who had clearly read the full file before walking in, did not waste time on pleasantries. She asked Ryan's attorney to summarize the basis for the petition, and he did, citing Dr. Voss's evaluation and expressing the family's concern for my safety. Gerald stood up when it was our turn and did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He didn't argue emotion at all. He laid the billing discrepancy on the table first, then the text message, then the locksmith's falsified, approved petition with Tiffany's handwriting matched against her closing documents, and finally the comparative market analysis showing the Whitmore offer was nearly $340, zeros under fair value. He said very calmly, "Your Honor, this is not a guardianship petition. This is a real estate transaction wearing a guardianship petition as a disguise." Judge Alvarez read through the exhibits for what felt like 20 minutes in total silence. Then she looked directly at Tiffany and asked her to explain the handwritten note on the locksmith's copy of the petition. Tiffany's mask, and I do mean it slipped like a mask, all at once, the composed real estate professional suddenly gone, cracked completely. She started talking fast about how the family really was worried, about how the Whitmore offer was actually generous given the condition of the dock, about how she'd only written approved, proceed, because she was confident it would be approved and didn't want to delay the locksmith. Judge Alvarez cut her off and said, without raising her voice at all, that representing an unapproved petition as an approved court order to a third-party contractor was itself a criminal matter separate from anything happening in her courtroom, and she was referring the entire file to the district attorney's office. She dismissed the guardianship petition in full on the record, finding no credible evidence of incapacity, and noted for the file that the property at 4471 Birchwood Point Road was, in any case, held in an irrevocable trust that the petition could never have lawfully effected. Ryan started crying at the table, the first time I'd seen him cry since he was maybe 15 years old. He turned to me and said, "Dad, I didn't know it went this far. I swear I didn't know about the doctor. I didn't know about the number." I believe him, for what it's worth. I believe Ryan is a man who got swept along by someone he trusted more than he trusted his own judgment. The exact thing Diane warned me about 4 years earlier, almost word for word. That doesn't make him blameless. But it makes him different from Tiffany, and the county's investigation, once it got underway, bore that difference out completely. Dr. Patricia Voss was referred to the State Medical Licensing Board for falsifying a clinical evaluation, and her license was suspended pending a full investigation, with formal fraud charges filed by the district attorney's office 2 months later. Tiffany was charged with elder abuse conspiracy, forgery of a legal instrument represented as a court order, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a designation I still find almost comical, given that I can bench press more than she weighs. But the law is the law, and the law was, for once, entirely on my side. The Whitmore Group withdrew from the proposed purchase within a week of the story becoming part of the public court record, apparently unwilling to have their name attached to an active elder fraud prosecution. Ryan filed for divorce 4 months later. I did not push him toward that decision, but I also did not try to talk him out of it. Jessica moved into the lake house with me for the winter, officially to help me with the upkeep before the ice broke up. Though we both knew it was really about neither of us wanting to be alone in the aftermath of watching a family fracture in a county courtroom. She rehung Diane's old quilts, which had been taken down and boxed by Tiffany during the brief period she'd had access to the house, back onto the same walls where they'd hung for 30 years. In November, she found the brass survey pin I'd driven into the southeast corner of the property back in 1987, half buried under leaves near the dock, and had it cleaned and mounted on a small wooden plaque, which she gave me for Christmas with a note that said, "You marked this ground once, so nobody could argue about where it started. I figured you'd want it on the wall now, since nobody's going to argue about where it ends. Either." By spring, the lupine came back around the base of the big white pine, the way it always had, the way it had every June since 1987, and I sat on the dock one evening in early June with Jessica, watching the light go long and gold across the water the way it does up here, and she asked me something I hadn't fully answered until that moment. She asked how I'd stayed so calm through all of it, the locked door, the fake diagnosis, the court date. I told her something I'd figured out over 4 decades of reading property lines. Other people couldn't see. You can look at a piece of land for years and think you understand its full shape. And then one survey, done properly, with the right instruments and the right patience, shows you where the boundary actually was the whole time, whether anyone had bothered to look for it or not. People are the same way. You can know someone for years and still not know the actual edges of who they are. until something forces the ground to show itself. I'd spent my whole career finding the true lines under what looked settled. I never expected to have to do it to my own family. But I did it, and the boundary held. Ryan and I talk now, slowly, carefully, mostly about small things, the Packers, the weather, whether the walleye are biting. It isn't what it was before, and I don't know if it ever will be, but it's something, and something is more than I had that Sunday night sitting alone on my own porch steps in the dark. Jessica still comes up most weekends. The 11 acres are still mine, still held in the same trust. Gerald drew up 2 years before anyone tried to take it from me, and I still walk the property line every spring, the same way I have for almost 40 years, checking the same corner pins, making sure the ground still says what I know it says. Some people look at a 67-year-old widower alone on a lake and see somebody who stopped paying attention. That was always going to be the mistake. I never stopped reading the lines. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe for more real family stories, and tell me down in the comments, what's the boundary in your own life that nobody thought you'd notice somebody crossing?